What this video reveals first is not Piers Morgan's worldview. It's the audience contract. The title promises a region-sized verdict in tabloid block capitals. Israel is despised. Trump's deal is threatened. Hezbollah is looming. So before a single argument is made, the viewer is trained to expect geopolitics as emotional weather. Not a hard question like what was actually agreed, by whom, under what enforcement mechanism, with what leverage. Instead, who looks humiliated, who looks cornered, whose side of the drama gets the biggest reaction shot. That's the real genre here. It's not analysis with guests. It's a panic carousel wearing the clothes of analysis. And the main substantive claim is slippery in a revealing way. The video says the US-Iran agreement gives both sides cover to declare victory while satisfying nobody, and that Israel and Hezbollah being folded into it means the arrangement is always on the edge of collapse. Fine, those are arguable propositions. But the program keeps sliding between three different questions without ever disciplining them. Is this a ceasefire analysis? A verdict on Trump's diplomacy? A forecast of Israeli escalation? A measure of Iranian strategic gains? Those are different analytical jobs. The video bundles them together because ambiguity is useful television. If the framework stays fuzzy, every guest can sound definitive while answering a slightly different question. Ian Bremmer is deployed first as the respectable spine of the argument, and you can see why. He offers the cleanest version of the show's thesis. Trump does not have a deal to be proud of. It may be worse than Obama's, and the arrangement leaves Israel furious while failing to settle the underlying confrontation. That is probably the strongest stretch of the whole video, because at least it identifies a concrete standard, durability, enforceability, strategic gain, and judges Trump against it. The problem is what the show does with that point. It doesn't use Bremmer's caution to narrow the claims. It uses him to inflate them. A limited critique of a weak agreement becomes proof of a grand regional humiliation story, and those are not the same thing. The weirdest omission is that for a video obsessed with the deal, it spends remarkably little time establishing the deal as an object. What are the actual terms? What is binding and what is theater? What exactly is meant by the inclusion of Israel and Hezbollah in the agreement? Formal obligations, tacit understandings, red lines, side commitments. The introduction talks as if the architecture is known and the consequences are now the question. But the conversation behaves as if the architecture can stay blurry because the atmosphere matters more. That's not a minor flaw. If you don't define the mechanism, every prediction about collapse becomes mood criticism masquerading as strategic analysis. Then there's the polymarket detour about Strait of Hormuz traffic returning to normal by the end of June, which is one of those tiny moments that tells you exactly what kind of information ecology you're in. A prediction market can be interesting as a sentiment signal. It is not, on its own, evidence of strategic reality. Yet dropping it into the middle of a war and diplomacy discussion performs a sleight of hand. It turns market chatter into quasi-analysis and lets the show borrow the aura of measurable probability without doing the hard work of proving causation. It's a perfect cable news object, numerical enough to feel serious, flimsy enough to mean whatever the host needs it to mean. And here's where the moral geometry of the video starts to bother me. For something about war, the human cost keeps getting displaced by elite positioning. The repeated questions are about whether Trump looks weak, whether Israel will go it alone, whether Republicans lose the House, whether the Gulf states recalibrate, whether China benefits. Those are legitimate dimensions of a regional crisis, but the program treats them as the main event. Civilian devastation, legal questions, the asymmetry of military power, the way escalation is lived by people who are not sitting in Washington or a studio in London. Those are background so aggressively that the whole thing starts to feel morally strange. Not because guests mention strategy, because strategy is allowed to swallow everything else. Jeffrey Sachs arrives, and the program briefly looks like it might become more intellectually honest, not because Sachs is automatically right, but because he tends to widen the frame beyond the horse race logic Piers prefers. He pushes the conversation toward long-term energy trends, Israel's regional position, China, structural consequences. The catch is that Sachs is also useful to the show for the opposite reason. He brings the flavor of big-picture dissent without forcing the host to resolve contradictions. So instead of a disciplined clash between competing causal stories, you get a buffet of sweeping claims. The audience can leave feeling they heard multiple sides when, in reality, the show has mostly curated multiple forms of certainty. The section on energy is a good example of the video's larger habit of reaching for scale without earning precision. Yes, conflict in and around Iran has obvious implications for shipping, insurance, supply chains, and price expectations. But the video repeatedly gestures at historic regional reshaping while doing almost none of the explanatory labor that phrase requires. What counts as reshaping? A short-term de-escalation? A new deterrence balance? A domestic political repositioning inside Israel? A durable US-Iran channel? The evidence does less work than the narration suggests because the narration keeps promoting possibilities into outcomes. You can feel the argument trying to become history before history has happened. Robert Pape, late in the video, actually exposes the weakness of the whole enterprise. He talks about ambiguity, pressure on Trump, and signs of an endgame in the Iran war. But once you say ambiguity and endgame in the same breath, you owe the viewer a lot more than this show provides. Endgame according to whom? Military endgame, diplomatic endgame, media endgame, electoral endgame? The program wants the dramatic force of the word without accepting the burden of definition. And that matters because the title is already priming viewers to interpret every strike, every threat, every pause as confirmation of some final reckoning. The content underneath is much less conclusive than the packaging. That's the larger cultural pattern this video belongs to. The conversion of foreign policy into spectator combat for audiences who are told they are consuming sophistication. You get experts, acronyms, references to shipping lanes, mentions of Congress, the ritual invocation of China, and a host who knows exactly how to keep the temperature high. But sophistication isn't the same as rigor. Rigor would mean slowing down the title's hysteria and asking which claims survive contact with evidence. Rigor would mean admitting that a weak agreement can still reduce immediate bloodshed, that a regional actor can be isolated in one arena and influential in another, that despised is not an analytical category, it's a crowd control device. So my verdict is harsher than just saying this is sensationalized. Sensationalized is normal. This is more corrosive than that because it launders vagueness through expertise. It takes real guests, real stakes, real danger, and turns them into a prestige argument for keeping the viewer permanently overclocked and permanently underinformed. The strongest part of the video is that some guests do raise legitimate doubts about Trump's leverage, Israel's room to maneuver, and the fragility of any arrangement involving Iran and Hezbollah. The biggest problem is that the show refuses to let those doubts stay specific. Everything gets absorbed into a grand melodrama where every uncertainty becomes proof of collapse. If you want to keep picking apart this kind of media, where the suit and tie version of panic is often more misleading than the outright propagandists, stick around. There's a whole ecosystem of it, and it deserves less deference than it gets.